once again, everyone, and welcome to part 3 of our Chapter 1 lecture series. I want to start out with this focus question. What happened when the peoples of the Americas came into contact with Europeans? Well, exploration and colonization set into motion what has become known as the Columbian Exchange. This is the exchange of plants, animals, diseases, and ideas between the old and the new worlds, and this exchange profoundly affected the lives and the societies on both sides of the Atlantic. The Europeans adopted native crops, and they also imported European and Asian livestock into the Americas. And this diagram here really illustrates this exchange in a visual manner. You can see such items as turkeys, corn, sweet potatoes, tomatoes, peppers, cacao, vanilla beans, etc., were all originally from the Americas, and as a result of European and American contact, ended up in Europe and Asia and the rest of the old world. Also, items from the European, Asian, and Old World areas also made their way to the Americas, particularly domesticated animals, which the Americas had very few of prior to European contact. Cows, horses, pigs, sheep, chickens. Diseases such as smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, diphtheria, scarlet fever. Plants like the dandelion, the crabgrass, olives, bananas, lemons, oranges, peaches, pears, etc. all were of European, Asian, or African origin and made their way into the Americas. And this exchange, again, profoundly altered all societies that it affected. One of the most profound effects of this exchange was the exchange of disease between the old and the new worlds. Syphilis particularly plagued the European colonists, but even more significantly, Europeans brought smallpox and influenza to the new world. Now, these diseases in particular were diseases that the natives of the Americas had no natural immunities to. They could not control these outbreaks, and this is one of those incidents of the law of unintended consequences at work. These diseases ultimately led to the death of, some say, up to 80 million natives. About, estimates vary anywhere from 70 to as much as 90% of the population of the Americas prior to European contact died as a result of their exposure to these diseases. And this decimation enabled Europeans to conquer the Americas. It really cannot be overemphasized how important this aspect of it was. If it wasn't for the decimation of the Native Americans as a result of these diseases, it is highly unlikely the Europeans would have been as successful as they were in conquest and colonization of the Americas. Now, on the Europeans' part, they honestly believed that they were bringing civilization to the natives. You know, when Christopher Columbus first encountered the Taino people, you know, they wore very little clothing. They did not have any of the advanced technologies or anything like that that the Europeans did. So to the European mind, this meant that they were uncivilized and not nearly as advanced as they themselves were. Now, the Spanish in particular developed what they called the requerimiento, which created a legal justification for Indian enslavement, and it invoked this idea of some sort of divine plan handed down by God that justified colonization and Indian enslavement. And it was all couched in this idea that the Europeans were bringing civilization to these natives. Now, not all Europeans agreed with this requerimiento or this divine plan. Particularly a Spanish priest by the name of Bartolome de las Casas spoke out heavily against the Spanish attempts to enslave the Indians and colonize those regions. And he wrote a book that spread around Europe very quickly and created what has been termed the Black Legend of Spanish cruelty towards the Native Americans, that is based somewhat in fact, but greatly exaggerated through many different modes. But this black legend was something that other Europeans, particularly the French and the English, used as justification in their own attempts to colonize a new world and to oust the Spanish from the Americas. Slavery and disease decimated the natives and led to the importation of African slaves. Because the population decline of the Native Americans was so great, they could not supply the labor that the colonists required to increase their economic output and to enrich the mother country, if you will. So therefore, as a result of that, the Europeans, particularly the Spanish at this time, sought other means to supply that labor that they needed. Now, the Africans had natural immunities to many of the diseases that the Native Americans did not have, and thus they survived longer than those Native American slaves and became the basis for slavery in the New World. When we talk about European motivation for the colonization and conquest of the Americas, we have to talk about the religious situation in Europe, particularly in the 16th century, just as colonization and conquest was really getting heated up. This all stemmed initially from Martin Luther and his 95 Theses, which began the reform movement known as the Reformation and created Protestantism. Luther called out the Catholic Church for corruption, particularly the sale of indulgences, which were basically like get-out-of-hell free cards that parishioners could purchase from priests in order to absolve themselves from sin. But of course, these purchases greatly enriched the Catholic Church. Now, as a result of the Reformation and the creation of Protestantism, the Catholic Church began its own reform movement called the Counter-Reformation. And a particular highlight of that was the creation of new missionary societies, particularly the Society of Jesus or the Jesuits. Now, these missionaries believed very strongly in education, and they became kind of the front guard of the Catholic Church, and particularly of the Spanish Catholics, in their attempt to evangelize the Native Americans and bring them into the Catholic fold. There really became a competition between Protestants and Catholics for souls, and it was seen as whoever could convert the most, both Europeans and Native Americans, somehow held more power, more religious authority. Now, this Reformation also spread elsewhere as well. The Act of Supremacy made by King Henry VIII of England made him the head of a new church, the Church of England, which split from the Catholic Church. Now, his daughter, Elizabeth I, established some religious moderation, but the Puritans, a sect of the Church of England, who really wanted to keep religious practices more pure, thus the term Puritans, who were also followers of a Swiss Protestant reformer named John Calvin, fled to the New World, seeking to be able to practice their particular brand of religion to a more free extent. Now, the Huguenots, who were French Calvinists, were also being persecuted in France, and many of them also fled to the New World to escape this persecution. Now, as I mentioned before, these religious rivalries in Europe led to these redoubled efforts to convert Native Americans to Christianity in this ever-heated competition for souls. Now, other Europeans followed Columbus, but the Spanish certainly took the lead at first, inspired by the potential wealth and glory of conquest. Now, the Spanish who made their way to the New World were generally poor to middle-class Spanish men who did not have a lot of opportunity for advancement in Spain and its very hierarchical and royal and noble-based society. There was not a lot of, exchange between the social classes or advancement into a higher social class. So going to the New World and establishing a presence there, obtaining wealth and glory and gold and land was a way for these guys to gain more power and a little bit more authority. And these guys were known as conquistadores, and some of the most famous of these gentlemen included Hernan Cortez, who conquered the Aztec Empire in modern-day Mexico. Now, of course, he was very much aided by iron weapons, by gunpowder, which were, technologies that the Native Americans did not have. But even more important than that, however, Cortez was able to enlist the enemies of the Aztec Empire, who was seen by the peoples they had subjugated as brutal conquerors. So they were more than happy to assist Cortez in his conquest of the Aztecs. And of course, disease also played a significant role. Right before the final battle that led to the fall of the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, there was a outbreak of smallpox in Tenochtitlan that decimated the Aztec warriors and severely impeded their ability to fight back against Cortez and his Native American allies. Now, down in Peru in South America, similar situation occurred when Francisco Pizarro conquered the Incan kingdom down in South America as well, in a much similar fashion that Cortez has conquered the Aztecs. As a result of these conquests and the discovery of massive deposits of gold and silver in these regions, the Spanish crown was soon getting an influx of tons of wealth from the New World, which also opened the eyes to other European powers about the potential for their own colonization and conquest of the Americas. Now, what did life look like in Spanish America in these early years? Well, the authority was very hierarchical. It started with the king and flowed downward, and the Catholic Church, particularly through those missionary societies that I had just mentioned, definitely held a substantial amount of authority on matters of faith, and particularly on matters of treatment of the Native Americans. The Native Americans were generally controlled by the Catholic Church and these missionary societies, and their labor and the structure of their settlements was very much controlled by the Catholic Church and these societies. As a result of the immigration of Spanish men into the Americas, a whole new class developed known as Creoles, who were persons born in the colonies of European ancestry. And these native-born European Americans became sort of a local elite and eventually became to enjoy a substantial amount of authority over colonial affairs. Now, as far as the Spanish colonists' relation with the Native Americans, especially initially in the progress of Spanish colonization of the New World, very few Spanish women immigrated. The vast majority of the immigrants were Spanish men seeking gold, fame, and glory. And as a result, most of these Spanish men actually married Indian women. And this created another whole new class known as mestizos, who were the products of these European Indian marriages. And they actually became a large part of the population of Spanish America. And over time, a hybrid culture developed that was part Spanish, part Indian, and even part African in some areas. Contrary to the patterns in later English colonization, which very much kept ethnic and racial mixing to a very minimum, and when it did occur, it was generally frowned upon, this sort of mixing was actually encouraged in these Spanish regions. And as a result of all this mixing, different racial categories developed to describe these mixtures, and they were known as castas. And this actual image here, can't read it very well, but this is from a colonial Spanish era document that seeks to describe the various different castas that resulted from the various different ethnic and racial mixtures that resulted from these intermarriages and this interbreeding. And to a large extent, these castas helped to develop even greater hierarchies and different levels and grades of social and political and economic influence in the Spanish Americas. It's the end of part 3 of our Chapter 1 lecture series. Look forward to part 4. In the meantime, study hard, and I'll see you soon.